Snow falls in the frigid Siberian Arctic, where an American force shelters in a small village along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Suddenly, an explosion decimates the side of a building. From across the tracks, a Bolshevik force comes flooding out of the forest. The Russians fire their rifles. With each bullet, a stream of smoke exits their muzzles as it drifts in the freezing air. The Americans return fire. They're about to be overrun by angry Russian soldiers. No one wants to die in this frozen wasteland, so a retreat is ordered. The platoon of Americans covers one another as they run down the railway toward another regiment stationed to the north. The craziest thing is that the US soldiers aren't entirely sure why they invaded Russia in the first place, and now they're paying dearly for it. About a year before the United States sent troops to Russia, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky incited the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The US had just deployed troops in Europe to help the Allies defeat the Germans in World War I. When the revolution happened, the new communist regime pulled Russia out of the conflict and agreed to a tentative truce with Germany. The Allies continued to fight on, and eventually the tide of the war turned. By the following year, the Bolsheviks controlled a large part of Western Russia, but forces identifying themselves as the White Russians fought to take back their country from the communists. This group was made up of a motley crew of mostly loyalists and reactionaries, with some Democrats sprinkled in, all of which were against Russia becoming a communist state. At this point, American troops had been engaged in battles across Europe, and the German army was slowly falling to the Allied forces. On November 11, 1918, World War I came to an end, but as American soldiers prepared to return home from the brutality of war, a select group was ordered to remain behind. These soldiers were sent on a mission in northern Russia to help the White Russians maintain control of an important railway that allowed supplies to be transported to areas where the White and Red armies were engaged in battle. The United States maintained that they were staying out of the internal affairs of Russia, but secretly President Woodrow Wilson and other Allied leaders knew that if the Bolsheviks were victorious and defeated the White Russian forces, the country would become a full-fledged communist state that would pose a threat to capitalism and democracy around the world. 2 American forces were ordered to go over the Russian border and help maintain supply lines for the war against the Red Army. The wording used by Wilson for these missions was vague and had no clear goal. This was likely because if the United States took a side in the conflict playing out in Russia, they could be thrown into another war. The invasion needed to remain as covert as possible, and having no clear orders or objectives, the American soldiers within the borders of Russia were given plausible deniability. Unfortunately, having troops stationed within a country undergoing civil war can only lead to rising tensions and casualties. The US troops, who were now technically an invasion force in Russia, found themselves in a very dangerous situation. The Bolsheviks were becoming more and more powerful. It would only be a matter of time before the American forces and the Red Army met. When this happened, the United States would have to take a stand, or at least make some very difficult decisions. The invasion of Russia technically began in July 1918. The war in Europe could still have gone either way, but the Allies seemed to be losing. Since Germany no longer needed to worry about protecting their eastern front due to their newly formed peace with the Bolshevik government, German forces were able to focus on pushing west. They advanced further and further into France, leaving a wake of destruction in their path. The only way the German advance could be stopped was if the Allies somehow reopened the eastern front. British and French expeditionary forces were already in northern Russia, where they were working to open up this new front. At that same time, they hoped to supply the White Russian forces with resources that would allow them to defeat the Bolsheviks and rejoin the war. The other Allied leaders convinced Woodrow Wilson to send 13,000 troops across the Russian border to help with this effort. President Wilson agreed, and when American troops crossed into Russia, the invasion had officially begun. Since the United States wanted to maintain some form of deniability that what they were doing was not actually an invasion, Woodrow Wilson wrote a vaguely worded memo. The American expeditionary forces being sent to Russia had 3 main objectives. The first, guarding large caches of Allied weapons and supplies that were housed in Archangel and Vladivostok. These supplies were sent to the Russian cities before the country left the war, and therefore Allied command wanted to make sure they did not fall into the hands of the Red Army. The second objective was to support the 70,000 soldiers in the Czechoslovak Legion who were still a part of Allied forces in World War I. The Czech Legion was fighting the Red Army in Siberia, and since they were part of the Allies, the United States soldiers were to support them in any way they could. The final objective that Woodrow Wilson put into his memo was that the US soldiers were to avoid interfering with internal Russian affairs. However, they were also supposed to aid the Russians in self-governing or self-defense. Basically, Wilson was saying that the American soldiers should be helping the White Russians defeat the Bolsheviks by any means necessary, but they were not to let the communists find out that that was what they were doing. The reason that Wilson couldn't just outright say the US forces entered Russia to try to defeat the Bolsheviks was that it would have looked like they were declaring a war against a previous ally, but the lack of clarity around what the troops were actually doing in Russia ended up causing all sorts of confusion. This resulted in a very different mission evolving and the loss of hundreds of American lives. The US soldiers who were deployed to Russia were a part of the 339th Regiment. This group of soldiers was mostly from Michigan, which military strategists decided would make them ideal for the extreme cold that they would face in northern Russia. Before the invasion force left for their mission, they were trained in England by Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton to give them additional skills to survive in the brutal environment they were about to enter. After their training, the 339th packed their bags, boarded a plane, and flew to the Archangel, which sat just below the Arctic Circle. The men nicknamed their regiment the Polar Bear Expedition, which wouldn't be too far from the truth. As they approached the Archangel, temperature plummeted and the wind picked up. The soldiers looked out of the plane windows at the frozen landscape below. This mission was going to be brutal, and they weren't even entirely sure why they were there. Once the planes landed, the US soldiers were debriefed by the British commanders stationed at Archangel. Although their orders were only to defend the cache of Allied supplies in the city, this turned out to be a very small part of what they would actually end up doing. The British told the Americans to suit up as they were about to leave Archangel and head southeast toward Kaulas. This was not what they'd been instructed to do, but at that same time, the vagueness of their orders also meant they could pretty much do anything they wanted. The 339th deployed with the British soldiers to Kaulas. Their goal was to secure a railroad crossing that they could then use to connect supply lines to the Czechoslovak Legion fighting the Red Army to the east. British officer Lieutenant General Frederick Poole ordered the Polar Bear Expedition Force to sweep south along a critical railroad track and remove any Bolshevik forces that stood in their way. The Polar Bears moved down the railroad toward Kaulas. They encountered small bands of Bolshevik soldiers who they easily dispatched. The weather conditions were brutal, but the men had all been well trained. They pushed the Bolsheviks away from the railway and secured long stretches of it to aid in the movement of troops and supplies to other forces fighting the Red Army in the Siberian region. Unfortunately, the Polar Bears would never make it all the way to Kaulas. On November 11, 1918, the same day that World War I ended in Europe, the American soldiers found themselves in a bloody battle against Bolshevik forces. The Polar Bear Expedition, along with Canadian and Scottish troops, were making their way south when they encountered a large Red Army force. Bullets pelted the snow all around them as the Polar Bears dove for cover. The Red Army had captured a town along the railway and still had a large number of men stationed there. Grenades blew craters around the tracks. The Allied forces returned fire but were unable to break the Bolshevik line. They had to retreat back to the dense forest and regroup. When they reached safety, the soldiers heard the news that Armistice Day had been celebrated in France. They couldn't believe that while they were being shot at and killed by Russian soldiers, the boys in Europe were being sent home. This was demoralizing and made no sense to the soldiers still stationed in Siberia. If the war was over, why were they still fighting? The soldiers started to complain to their superiors and question what their actual orders in Russia were. Many Allied soldiers once believed that the Bolsheviks were secretly on the side of the Germans, which made fighting them a worthwhile cause. But now that Germany had been defeated, the American soldiers were freezing their butts off for no apparent reason. At this time, Major William Graves commanded another expeditionary force that invaded Russia from Vladivostok. This regiment had been deployed to protect the Allied supplies housed in the city. But like the Polar Bear Expedition in Archangel, these soldiers also had vague orders and would end up pushing further into Siberia than originally planned. Graves wrote later that at the time of the deployment, he was given no information as to the military, political, social, economic, or financial situation in Russia. This shows just how little the American soldiers who found themselves in the middle of a civil war in Russia actually had to go on. As 1918 turned into 1919, the Czechoslovak Legion controlled much of Siberia, including the Trans-Siberian Railway. In order to fulfill the ambiguous orders he was given, Graves ordered troops to be deployed along the railway and at the coal mines, which powered the whole thing. This meant that American forces would be moving further and further into Russia. Although no one wanted to say it, America had now invaded Russia on two fronts. The Trans-Siberian Railway was a vital lifeline for both the Czechs and the White Russians that were fighting against the Bolsheviks. Without the railway, supplies could not reach the forces spread throughout the country. But as the Americans worked to secure and maintain control of the railway, the White Russians did something drastic. In November 1918, a White Russian admiral named Alexander Kolchak overthrew a Czech-supported government in Siberia. This caused panic amongst the Czechoslovak Legion. Rather than continuing their fighting against the Red Army in northern Russia, they focused their attention on returning home. This put Graves in a precarious position. It was now his sole responsibility to maintain control of the Trans-Siberian Railway and secretly move supplies to the Polar Bears and other forces who were trying to capture Kolchak. In January of 1919, the Bolsheviks launched attacks along the Trans-Siberian Railway and deeper into Siberia, where American forces were positioned. It all started one freezing day 500 miles north of Moscow. Lieutenant Harry Meade and his platoon of 47 polar bears were held up in a small Russian village. They lit fires within the snow-covered homes as the temperature dipped to 45 degrees below zero. They had received word that the Red Army might be advancing on their position, but wouldn't reach them for several more days, at which point they would be long gone, or so they believed. Lookouts had been posted and the soldiers took shifts digging trenches into the frozen permafrost that surrounded the small village just in case they needed to defend themselves. The sun rose on January 19, 1919, causing a pink hue across the freshly fallen snow that made it look like cotton candy. One of the lookouts rubbed his eyes and stretched. He'd been up all night keeping an eye out for the enemy. It had been quiet, and his shift was about to end when he saw something move in the trees out of the corner of his eye. The sun was still low, and the trees from the forest cast long shadows along the railway. The darkness from the densely packed pine trees kept anything hidden within it. The lookout grabbed his binoculars and stared at the forest. He could have sworn something moved just on the edge of the trees. Perhaps it was a deer or a lone wolf. He put the binoculars down and rubbed his eyes, chalking whatever he thought he saw up to exhaustion. Suddenly, dozens of rifles fired simultaneously from the tree line. Rockets flashed as they ejected from their launchers and slammed into the buildings of the villages. The men started screaming as wood and rocks flew everywhere. Meade awoke his troops and ordered them to return fire. A wall of screaming Bolshevik soldiers ran out from the cover of the forest. The sunlight glinted off their bayonets attached to the rifles. The Americans continued firing, but there were just too many of them. Meade ordered his men to fall back and seek shelter. The Red Army soldiers shot at the retreating polar bears, killing several men in the ambush before they could scramble behind cover. Meade and his men took shelter in the buildings on the far side of the village just as shells began to fall from the sky. The Bolsheviks had set up mortars on the outskirts of the town and were unleashing a barrage of explosives that decimated the structures the Americans had taken shelter in. When the iron rain stopped falling, Meade peered out of the window and saw a terrifying sight. Bolshevik soldiers had moved to the flanks and were now closing in on three sides. They wore white uniforms and jackets that allowed them to blend in with the snowy landscape. The enemy looked more like ghosts than men. Meade ordered the machine guns to be mounted in the windows to keep the Bolsheviks at bay, but every time the polar bears would slow the Bolshevik advance on one side, the other two would move closer. It was a hopeless situation. The waves of Bolshevik soldiers never seemed to end. It was only a matter of time before Meade and his men's position was overrun and the Red Army slaughtered them all. Meade ordered a full retreat. The American soldiers exited the houses they were taking shelter in and headed for the edge of town. Every time they stepped out from behind cover, someone else was gunned down. The Bolsheviks were unrelenting and ruthless. If a polar bear fell, their body had to be left behind. 25 Americans died in the battle. Their bodies lie where they fell, so the rest of the expeditionary force could make it out of the village alive and retreat further up the railway. When Meade and his men met up with another American platoon, they had lost over half of their force and had 15 injured soldiers who desperately needed medical attention. This was the beginning of the Bolsheviks' offensive into northern Russia in January of 1919. The Red Army had the Polar Bear expedition outnumbered 8-1. They pushed the Americans further and further north. It seemed that if something wasn't done to immediately bring the men home, they would either be driven all the way to the Arctic or killed by the Bolsheviks. Politicians and military leaders worked tirelessly to try and get the U.S. soldiers home, but there were still those in government who believed the polar bears needed to be kept in Russia to keep the country from falling to the Bolsheviks. The Polar Bear expedition was pushed all the way back to Archangel, where they'd held out until May when the ice began to thaw and the White Sea became passable. As the men loaded up everything of importance onto the ships leaving the city to head back to Europe, the Bolsheviks began to seize Archangel. Battles broke out on the outskirts of the city, but eventually the Red Army gained the upper hand and the Bolsheviks pushed into Archangel. Fights broke out in the streets as polar bears desperately tried to hold the Bolsheviks at bay for as long as possible. The ships were finally loaded, and the Allied forces still in Russia managed to escape. On June 15, 1919, the last of the Polar Bear expedition left Archangel and headed back home. In all, around 235 Americans died on the Western Front of the invasion of Russia, and not a single man could explain exactly why they were there in the first place. As the polar bears were headed home, the American soldiers who had been launched from Vladivostok continued to fight in Siberia. Even though the Polar Bear expedition had been a disaster, Woodrow Wilson still wanted American troops in Russia to maintain control of the Trans-Siberian Railway and to keep the White forces resupplied. However, there was a new threat looming on the horizon. Japan had been a former ally during World War I but had quickly become aggressive as the emperor dreamed of expanding his country's borders and influence. 72,000 Japanese soldiers were launched across the sea and landed in Siberia. They advanced toward Major William Graves and the American forces that held the railway. Even though they had once been allies, the Japanese soldiers no longer were considered friendlies. Their expansion into Asia and Siberia posed a serious threat to the White Russians and the American men who were still there. As all this was happening, Graves's worst nightmare came true. The very army they were trying to help turned on them. The White Russians wanted the Americans to either formally fight with them or get out. They were tired of American forces being in their country without choosing a side. The Japanese troops shared the same sentiment but wanted the Americans out of the region for their own reasons. Without the Americans there, the Japanese would be able to advance further into Siberia and claim the Trans-Siberian Railway for themselves. White Russian forces began to work with Japanese forces as they swept through Siberia, causing unprecedented amounts of carnage and chaos. Innocent people were executed and tortured. Cossack generals Grigory Semenov and Ivan Kalmykov roamed the frozen regions of the country, killing anyone they thought was sympathetic to the Bolshevik cause and taking whatever they wanted with the support of Japanese troops. Eventually, these forces turned their attention toward the Americans. It seemed that fighting would break out between the U.S. soldiers still stationed along the Trans-Siberian Railway and the White Russians at any moment. If this happened, the United States would have no choice but to openly declare war and either send more troops to Russia or risk the lives of the Americans stuck in Siberia. As tensions rose, the Bolsheviks became stronger and stronger. They secured more cities and transportation routes while growing in numbers. The White Russians were losing badly on all fronts. Admiral Alexander Kolchak pleaded with the Czech Legion for help, but he'd already burnt that bridge when the White Russians invaded Czechoslovakian territory and committed countless crimes against the people in the region. Rather than helping Kolchak, the Czechoslovakians turned him over to the Red Army in return for safe passage home. In January of 1920, Woodrow Wilson and his advisors decided the secret war in Russia had failed. They ordered all U.S. troops out of the country as the Trans-Siberian Railway was all but lost to the Bolsheviks. By April 1, 1920, the last of the American invasion forces was withdrawn from Russian borders. 189 men were lost in Siberia. Each one had only a very vague idea of what they were doing there in the first place. Woodrow Wilson's decision to invade and keep troops in Russia in order to influence its internal affairs foreshadowed future endeavors by the United States to do similar things in other countries. The U.S. had no business being in Russia after World War I, just as it had no business being in other countries later in the century. Now watch What's Wrong with Russia's Military, or check out These Countries Are Impossible to Invade.